it's not possible to reduce language into neat rules that you memorize and then practice and then go and apply. And so if your self-talk is, I'm not good at learning languages, then you're going to have problems. If you are fluent enough in English to understand our conversation here, you can acquire another language.
Dr. Diane Neubauer is a specialist in how we learn languages. Not only that, she's a Chinese Mandarin speaker and teacher. She got her PhD in multilingual education from the University of Iowa and is about to start as Clinical Assistant Professor of Multilingual Education at the University of Louisville. She's got a podcast for language teachers as well as a YouTube channel with content for learners of Chinese. I'll put links for both in the description. In this interview, she explained how we learn languages, the mistakes you need to avoid, and whether Chinese is actually a difficult language to learn. Enjoy. How is it that adults learn new languages?
Right. That is a huge question. And there's a lot of people trying to answer that in multiple ways. And so I think it depends on how deeply you want to go. So here's my short answer. I think there's cognitive elements. There are innate processes in the mind that are happening as we're gaining additional language, and your mind is sorting out and making its own new system for language. So at a cognitive level, there's that going on. There's experiences with language that are affecting what kinds of things the mind has as resources to build that new system of language. And so the kinds of input you have, the sorts of what you get from whatever language exposure you have, how much you understand it, how rich it is, how communicative it is. These are things that are going to affect the way that progress goes. And then there are social factors where you're joining a language community, and how supportive that community might affect your progress and your experience of gaining that additional language, how much help others give you, how much you have the opportunity to get feedback that is of a supportive kind so that you get more input that you can understand. So those kinds of factors all are in play. And so those are the same factors that happen for a child. But because the adult has a very strong, at least one language already, there's a language system in the mind. There's cognitive, there's the conscious learning kinds of processes that are way active in an adult. Like you're very conscious of your progress or your failure to progress as you thought you should. And so there are additional kinds of emotional factors that go into that I think very young children, because they're really still gaining their first language, they don't feel it in the same way. And they're cognitively, developmentally, they don't have some of the same issues adults do. So I find in teaching adults or learning myself as an adult, remembering to coach, what is the process like? What are the outcomes I can expect? Where am I today? And what is my next step? Those kinds of factors we can't do with a 5-year-old as well. But for adult learners, I think that is helpful for them to understand the process so that they can relax, make good choices with the time available to them, and reach for the goals that they personally have.
Yeah. And from that, it sort of sounds that the process for adults is very similar, but there are other external factors that might change their experience of that process of picking up that new language.
Right. And then the fact that there is less time on task for most adult learners, unless you're able to just take off work and family and other life responsibilities. Most adults have to squeeze that into the little niches of their life. So that's a challenge as well. And others may, if you're trying to use that language, people aren't always as patient with an adult learner who doesn't seem fluent. The way that when a 2 or 3-year-old child does it, it's adorable. And everyone is just cooing. But it's harder for adults to find that kind of supportive caretaker kind of relationship with others in the language they're learning.
For a beginner, so an adult learner who's not in a classroom or anything else like that, where do they start? How do they start to learn a new language in this way?
Mm-hmm. I think it's much more challenging when you're entirely on your own. The internet has changed that significantly because you can start to search and find other ideas. You're looking for some kind of way to get a lot of experience in the language at a very high level of comprehension. So you're at least understanding at the message level. You know kind of what's going on. You might not be able to pick out each and every word and match it up to meaning in your own first language, but you can follow a story. You can follow the meaning of a conversation. You know what's going on, at least that level, preferably even more so, especially if you have the opportunity to interact with someone. So if somebody is trying to ask you questions, you want to understand that question very well to be able to answer. So, someone says, "How are you?" and you say, "Correct." That's going to be a obvious problem. And so if you're getting that opportunity to talk with people, you want an even higher level of comprehension, I would say, so that you can really participate, even if your answers are just head nods and very short phrases in answer. I would look first to things like YouTube, where it says something like comprehensible input, name of language. If you can find things like that, not everything labeled like that will really suit. And sometimes I find that some of those materials are actually pitched towards somebody who already has 100 or so hours in the language. That's still a beginner, but if you're absolutely at ground zero, it's very challenging, I think, to start without any help at all. Therefore, my background is in language education. And so I recommend looking for a teacher, especially at that beginning level, somebody that can be that supportive, social back and forth with you, who can track your comprehension level and adapt their speech to the need that you have to understand, that can make it more engaging, more personally relevant by what you talk about, rather than just, memorize textbook dialogues or something like that, but can in real time adapt what they say to what you're understanding, what you seem to respond more to, and continue from there.
The big question then is, how does someone then find a teacher like that? Would there be any clues for someone to go, oh, that's the kind of teacher that Diane's talking about?
I find if you are hearing somebody talk about stories as the basis of their teaching, sometimes that will help. If they're talking about teaching grammar in context versus studying grammar outside, sometimes that in context can be helpful. Stories, comprehensible input, maybe communication, maybe teaching things in context. Those might be phrases to look for. If they start saying first I teach this kind of grammar, then I do this kind of grammar, here's my vocabulary list, everybody learns from day one, that's a little rigid.
And so whilst we're on it then, so what is the problem of the stereotypical traditional approach of lists of grammar rules and vocabulary lists to memorize? What's the problem with that when it comes to language learning?
I think it's treating language as if it's another subject matter. Like if you can, from the outside, analyze and neatly put it into little boxes. And I know you've interviewed Bill Van Patten. I know him and have read a lot of what he talks about, but it's absolutely not just him talking about the complexity of what language is like. It's not possible to reduce language into neat rules that you memorize and then practice and then go and apply. And so it gives you a sense of progress because you can measure quickly, like, oh, I could do the thing. But it's not developing a really strong, robust, flexible, dynamic system in your mind with that new language as well. You get something. It's something. It's not nothing. But it's ultimately, it's not, it's a very skewed version of the way the language works.
What would be the biggest misconception you think students have around learning a new language?
I think that I'm going to spin it by the contrast. They don't have enough of a Zen mindset. What I mean by that, I'm not Zen. I'm not a Buddhist, but I'm a Christian actually. But what I mean by this is, I think that's the first thing maybe to appeal to, that your outcome is not necessarily the thing that you rehearse and push hard to do. You need to back off. You need to keep that aim in mind, yes. But your main, especially at a beginner level, your main goal is to really be taking in and understanding and responding to, rather than producing. When I've started teaching adults who had that kind of, again, that present, practice, produce kind of model, where they thought, well, I should be making a lot of sounds with my mouth, or I'm not going to, how am I learning this? And so helping them to relax, to feel their progress over a few weeks, they could tell that they were able to understand much more Chinese, and I teach Chinese, than they could produce. And so telling them that is very typical, very ordinary. That is part of the process. So keep pursuing more and more of that input as you proceed.
So the other thing that I wanted to ask is, especially in the world of YouTube and language learning, all that kind of stuff, one thing that everybody seems to want is results quickly. How can I be fluent in 6 months, a year, whatever it is? From what we're talking about, that sounds like that's going to be pretty difficult for a learner to do, potentially. But is there any way that a learner can speed up the process of acquisition or make it more efficient in some way?
Yes and no. It depends on how technically you mean that question. And so I would say in some respects, there are things that are immutable about the way an individual's mind works. I do think individuals have different paces. So some are really accelerated, like they have a high aptitude for language. It's not that others can't gain another language, but that some might be quite gifted at that and therefore make more fast progress. That I think is possible. But in terms of accelerating, mostly it's like the quality of the experiences you have with the language, the kind of social network and support you have, and how much time on task so that your mind can do the work of building that language. I do find it can be helpful to take breaks. I'm thinking of a time I lived in China and I was studying full time while I was there for the first few months. And when we got to a break in the school year, we had a couple weeks off. My teacher said, it's really good. I see that my students take this break. I suggest don't study these 2 weeks. And I was thinking, what? I had all my plans, And the teacher said, what I see happen is when students really take a rest, they come back with more ability in the language than when they left. And I can see how that happens. You are doing things that you are not aware you are doing with that language, sometimes even with a short break. In longer pauses, yes, you might have some attrition. You might end up losing some, or at least losing the immediacy of recall. But if you can take a little break sometimes, I think it actually is good to do that.
You teach Mandarin online, and obviously you've got quite a lot of experience in teaching anyway. So when it comes to someone who's normally an adult learner, what's the benefit for them to trying to learn a new language online?
Access to resources, timing.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's an online class that meets synchronously, like the ones that I teach, you have the flexibility of being anywhere. Possibly even, I had students sometimes had to go down to the laundromat during class time. And so she'd keep her camera off, but she was listening. She was engaged in the class. She was adding things to the chat. And so those kinds of opportunities are, of course, impossible. And especially, I think, for a less commonly taught language, you have access to far more resources than you would if you were just searching for somebody local, particularly if you don't live in a big metropolitan area.
What's the benefit of actually having a teacher? Because so many people online will just use resources that are to hand. But what can actually having a teacher bring to learning a new language?
Mm-hmm. I think that's I'm going to say the phrase language parent might come from Chris Lonsdale, and it may be from someone before that. But the idea of somebody who is able to observe your progress, who knows the kinds of things that you need, especially at that beginning level, and can adapt to where you are today in real time as they see you, as they interact with you, as they ask you for responses. Again, that might not be verbal necessarily, but they're reading your comprehension, your interest, and adapting to that in real time. That is very hard to do. Even right now with AI, you have to kind of steer the AI and coach the AI into doing the right thing for you. And I haven't yet seen that really do what a human can do. So I think that's the advantage. Some of the pressure is off of taking pains to make your own plan, like what content will I do next? You might not be able from the outside of the language to know what is really commonly used language or what is high frequency language, but your teacher may. They may be able to, because they're communicating with you, they may naturally bring in those key phrases that are very common in the language you're gaining. So
if students are going to go, I think actually I will try and have a teacher. I've got this language parent to guide me through this process. So again, we've touched on it briefly, but if people are going to try and find a teacher, what makes a good teacher when it comes to teaching new languages?
It's not necessarily the case that someone who is trained to be a language teacher is the best language teacher. It's also not the case that the native speaker is the best language teacher. They have cultural fluency that is very important, but a non-native speaker of a language can be an excellent language teacher and may know your points of need because of their own personal experience in acquiring that language. What will be confusing to you? What will you easily misunderstand? And they can highlight those things as they go in a way that sometimes native speakers find more challenging. As we were talking before about what kinds of things would you look for in terms of maybe a description of a class or something. You're looking for comprehension-based, maybe story-based teaching, maybe communication. So particularly, again, if your goal is to be able to communicate in the language rather than simply to analyze it and to understand it from the outside, but to engage in the language with other people, then those things are going to be a priority.
Oh yeah, and for this would be your experience as a teacher. What are the common mistakes that you think you see learners often make, and what should they try and avoid?
I think much of the things that I think actually seem to affect their progress are beliefs and attitude about themselves as a learner. And so if your self-talk is, I'm not good at learning languages, then you're going to have problems. And because you're maybe going to hinder your own progress, ultimately that doesn't stop you from acquiring a language if you're doing all the right things, but you might hate the process when you didn't have to. You could really enjoy yourself more.
Yeah, definitely. And just coming back what you mentioned about self-talk, I do think that is possibly one of the biggest thing that particularly beginners struggle with, of, I can't learn a language, or I'm not good at this. Well, you're going to struggle if your entire belief system is, oh, this is going to be not an enjoyable experience. Whereas particularly if we focused on input-based learning, you can have a great time whilst you're picking up this language without having to force that process in your head, right?
Exactly. You have, if you are fluent enough in English to understand our conversation here, you can acquire another language.
A lot of people think that Chinese is a difficult language to learn. That's kind of one of the things that I hear a lot of people say. What are your thoughts on the idea that Chinese in particular is difficult?
I have a lot of feelings on this. I would like to take the word difficult and give a couple other D's. So take difficult and put it over there, and distant, and different. So distant and different from English or other European languages, rather than difficult. Because, for example, for somebody from a language that is more closely related to Mandarin Chinese, it is not so hard to grasp Chinese. Yeah, it's not that inherently Mandarin or other Chinese dialects are more difficult. It is that to an English speaker from the outside, it's just very different. You can't pick up a text written in Chinese and sound it out.
Yeah.
And you can't, the structure of the language is going to feel a little different. In fact, there are things that are easier in Chinese, particularly verb forms never change. There is no conjugation. There is no verb tense. I would think, think about what your goals are. What outcomes do you need? What ways do you want to use this language? Like, I want to be able to read very fluently.
Yeah.
I don't feel as much of a need to be able to handwrite everything.
Just thinking of characters and things. When it comes to either teaching for yourself or learners learning, the characters and the tones of Chinese are also something that's going to be different for the majority of learners, certainly from an English speaking background. How is it you recommend that learners try and pick those up?
I think being aware of the concept there are tones is enough. What I don't find necessary, and I used to do in teaching, and I was exposed to in my own learning of Mandarin Chinese first, and that was learning the whole tone system understanding what those all related to, I wait until a student asks. So when I'm in class, I actually use the whiteboard that's over here, and I'm writing on the whiteboard with pinyin letters, and there are tone marks there. If a student says, what are you doing with those accent marks? I say, oh, those are tone marks. Let's see, here, you compare. So here's, and then I do some comparison of some syllables that they would be familiar with already. Do you hear the difference there? Well, that, I wait till they've got a sense of question arising. It's Chinese teachers typically that get anxious about that, or students who have been told, well, oh, Chinese tones, that's really hard. You're going to have trouble with that. I think that the fear of, it's called fossilization. There's, I think maybe there's a very narrow way that is a real thing, but for the majority of situations, if we do something wrong as a beginner, if we're hearing and exposed to lots of language that we understand and we're in that language environment a lot, then that little bit of oops or developmental form or error that we made is not fossilizing there. I think if you were drilling them and they were only producing language and they weren't hearing others speak, that you could have a problem. But if you're getting good quality input in the language, I think that overemphasis on get that tone right in your production from day one, you just don't need that so much. And if you delay it even like 2 days, 3 days, students start to speak in a way that they have heard a lot. And I don't, again, 98, 99% of the time, they're doing just fine. With characters, I find it a little different. I think what I've come to like best in learning to read in Chinese is an approach initially based off of work by Terry Baltz. She calls it cold character reading. The idea is that you have this text that only contains words that you know by sound. You didn't memorize the characters in advance, but you know the sounds of the words. And so when they're new, you're writing the pinyin, you're seeing the pinyin, the phonetic spelling of the Chinese. And as you read, all that pinyin is set aside, but there's a text that has just characters from words that you know, and the teacher starts guiding. And because the reading is designed in such a way, kind of like a Dr. Seuss books, if you're familiar in English, they're written simply. There's a repetitive use of just a few words, but there's a meaning to it. There's a story, there's conversations, there's something. So there's a long text, but it reuses only a few new characters at once. I produce some that are along those lines of that model. I call them read along videos, read along videos where they're on YouTube, where you can listen to the sounds read aloud, or you can mute it and try to predict, okay, it's going to sound like this. And they are designed in that same way, where there's just a few new words added to the text from what you've learned before. And you're building just a little bit more of your character recognition over time.
I guess that would be not too dissimilar from native Chinese or native Mandarin speakers who will have a level of proficiency in the language at the point they start to read. You don't expect a child to immediately start reading. They've already got some level of communicative ability by that stage anyway, haven't they?
Right. And it's very strong. So the teacher's appealing to language that they already know by sound. And now they're just attaching, like I do this thing when I'm talking to people about this. So I'm trying to connect sound to meaning, sound to meaning, sound to meaning. The child in China has that very, very strong. So then when we've got that really strong, we just, now this is how it looks. Oh, look at that character. That's what that looks like. Huh, how about that? I mean, that can become the attitude of it. Like it's this discovery process in this reading, rather than that, oh, there's this sound, this meaning, there's this etymology, there's this other thing. And they all look, and it's like you're trying to do 7 or 8 things all at once. Well, no wonder you're overwhelmed. Can you just do sound to meaning for a while? When that feels strong, now you have the mental working space, the working memory to then, when I read it, oh, that's how that old friend looks.
What's your opinion on the classic for Chinese is to remember the first, let's say, 2,000 characters, you just need to do flashcards and just get through them in order to learn the most used characters, and then at some point after that you get to have a good time and do the reading. But before that, you've got to do the flashcards. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's not necessary to get. It's certainly not 2000.
Okay.
I mean, if you enjoy that, I don't think that's harmful per se, but it's a limited window on knowing that word. It's a very limited window. You don't know what's the context in which this is used. What connotation does this have? You gain those things by reading them in context or hearing them and seeing them in social actions. So you need more diverse input. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, just to so no, it's not playing devil's advocate, but plenty of people will say if I've mentioned flashcards before, they say, oh, well, it won't be just the one character, it will be a sentence. And you've got to, then you see that character in context, which...
that now you've, instead of this narrow of a window, you've made it this narrow of a window. Because if that one sentence, that's not, in what context is that sentence appearing? What other sentences does that word appear in? Like that. Yeah, I think learning based on a sentence, like sentence mining as a strategy, I think that can be helpful. But again, that's still, you want something more diverse as well.
What about things like practicing tone pairs? If I'm sort of reading out these pairs of words out loud in order to practice that change of tone between one word to the other to make sure I maintain my level of speaking, my pronunciation, everything.
Yeah, as I was saying, with any kind of focus on form or focus on forms even, this is a Michael Long term. He's a researcher. So the idea is that when we can focus on meaning, we can focus on form, we can focus on forms. So he would say, like, if we're focusing on form, like, oh, if I get these two tones produced correctly, I'm going to be more understandable. So people are going to get my meaning. I would say that can be helpful a little bit, but it's after it's honing what you've already got. It's not precursor to gaining it. So when the words are brand new, I wouldn't worry about it too much. I would focus in on understanding it, on hearing it in context, on seeing how people are using those words.
From that, would I be right in thinking it's more about focusing on communicating meaning for those interactions rather than just thinking I've got to get the perfect tones for no reason whatsoever?
Right. I think sometimes it can hinder you actually from being communicative, being able to express meaning. If you're so fixed on, I am thinking of every letter as I speak it, like you hinder the progress, I think, of the actual communication.
Okay.
And I think the other thing too is knowing that you are probably going to not sound like a native speaker. If you're not a native speaker, that's okay. I think we need to decenter the idea that the native speaker is the thing that you have to become. You have to become understandable enough to the native speaker. I hope that I sound pleasant enough that people want to hear me if I need to speak to them in Chinese.
So just a fairly big question, but I'd be interested in what your response to this would be. So let's say tomorrow you wake up and you've forgotten all of your Chinese. You have to start from square one again. Exactly, what would you do? What would that look like to get you back to the point that you're fluent in the language?
Well, it has taken me some time. So I started in college so I would do it differently than the way that I was taught. I would be looking for a beginning level, I retain my understanding of what I think about how to acquire language now. I would go with this. I would look for a beginning level teacher who would give me that kind of scaffolding, that sort of personalized experience, that's comprehension-based experience that's relevant to me. I would ideally rewatch the video from class after class a couple days later. I would delay some of my reading emphasis. I would do it in context based on things I already knew orally, and I would read based on that. Just a few new characters in each text, seeing them a whole lot of times. I would approach it that way. And I mean, I guess I can say, I am doing that in other languages still. Like I have like a low intermediate level of French. I'm seeking out level appropriate opportunities to encounter French, both reading and oral input, sometimes through a teacher, sometimes just finding things online.
Yeah, interesting. So I think this will be my last question, and I'll let you get on with your big to-do list. So if you could give learners sort of one piece of advice or one thing to take away, what would be the piece of advice that you'd give them to help them on their language journey?
I actually find that kind of hard to say. I would say maybe it's a combination of like, have a sense of your goal, but know what to do next and do it. Just do that one next thing. So you're aimed in a good direction, but you're not pressured by that end goal. Just like, okay, I know these are things that are going to be helpful to me. I'm going to do that next thing. I'm going to do that next thing, rather than feeling under the pile by the goal, not still being way far out there, perhaps. I'm speaking as a perfectionist myself, recovering perfectionist, we'll call it that. Just knowing that, I can't do that thing yet, but I can do this thing. I'll do this thing. That'll keep me moving in the direction that I want to go.
Small steps. Have a goal and small steps to get there. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. I think we'll leave it there unless there's anything else you want to add, Diane.
I know it, but it's been delightful. It's been fun to talk.